Hi everyone. We're waiting 2 to 3 minutes before starting the webinar to accommodate for the rest of the attendees who are in the middle of connecting. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valan Kolika and I'll be your host for today. Just a few reminders before starting. If you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation and are using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. And if you're using the desktop version of Teams, please exit and rejoin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. During this time, please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking on the Ask Question button. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your questions anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. We often get many questions on these webinars, and we will do our best to respond to all of them in real time. In the event if the answer was not provided, or if you may have additional questions post this event, please don't hesitate to raise them on our Azure Sentinel forum at aka.ms/Azure Sentinel community. If you're listening to this after the fact as a recording, that's also a great place to ask questions. We love to hear your feedback on how we can improve in these webinars. You can do so at aka.ms/security webinar feedback. While you're there, please join our community by visiting our aka.ms/security community. That's the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews, and you can do that by signing up at aka.ms/security private preview. And while you're there, you can request features, give feedback, review our product roadmaps, attend in-person events, or join webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. In today's session, Ofer will be taking us through MSSP and distributed organization support using Azure Sentinel. Ofer Shazaf is a principal program manager from our Sentinel team. And without further ado, I will turn it over to him. Ofer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me. You're a large number, and I'm glad to see so many of you interested in Azure Sentinel, even in a more advanced topic such as cloud architecture. I joined Microsoft a year and a half ago. I came from ArcSight, a legacy SIEM vendor. And when I joined, my boss told me, I know you know SIEM, that's why I hired you. Now go learn cloud. And he was so right. During the last year and a half, I had to learn a lot about the cloud. Azure Sentinel is a cloud-native SIEM. You take advantage of the cloud to provide you, hopefully, the best SIEM experience available. And it's also a very good solution for closing the gap around cloud monitoring. With this comes the requirement to match Azure Sentinel architecture to your cloud architecture. And when I say cloud, I'll focus on Azure today. Some of it is relevant also for AWS or any other cloud. But since Azure Sentinel is a service within Azure, Azure is naturally the core. For smaller organization, a single instance of Azure Sentinel will serve you well. The challenge is smaller. But for larger organizations that have multi-tenancy subsidiaries, geographies, what have you, and also for MSSPs who support a large number of customers, which are also distributed across geographies, tenants, etc. The question of how to best architect Azure Sentinel to work for you and to serve you best is an important one. And this is the question I'll try to answer in this webinar today. The webinar is part of a series. Valon and Ryan helped me create a number of webinars that cover different aspects of Azure Sentinel. The link below, aka.ms/Sentinel Ninja Training, would lead you to a blog post that we published that include all the relevant webinars, including the relevant resources which they reference, such as blog posts or documentation links. So that would be a very good place to start your journey to learn more about Azure Sentinel outside of the session today. What will we discuss today? So we'll start with a short overview of Azure, just the basic terms for those who are not experts on that side. I expect that some of you come from Microsoft and cloud background and may know that. Some of you are security experts, you know everything about SIEM just as I did when joining Microsoft, but you may need a refresh on the Azure terminology. We'll then discuss in short the Sentinel workspace. So what is a single instance of Azure Sentinel? And that's what a smaller organization will use. We'll then dive into the need and the best practices for using more than one instance of Sentinel, so multi-workspace architecture. We'll see why you may need it, why you may not need it or be able to avoid it, and assuming, like most large organizations and any MSSP that you do have multi-workspaces, how to best approach working across them. Lastly, I'll spend a few minutes on a few topics which are specific to MSSPs. They may be a bit less interesting to large distributed organizations, which is IP protection. So how can you protect the content that you create for the SIEM from your customers? And billing, how if working in a distributed environment, how do you bill your customers and pay us? So a bit of an exotic specific items there at the end. Let's start with Azure Basics. The most important concept which we'll start with today is the tenant. The term is a bit misleading. Multi-tenancy is often referred to something entirely different in the world of enterprise software and SIEM as a service. It usually refers to the fact that you use a single system to serve multiple customers. But the Microsoft tenant is the basic identity management framework used by customers in the Microsoft Cloud. Azure Active Directory, which is what AAD stands for, is your repository for essentially users, groups, authentication, and it includes within it subscriptions. The subscriptions are the actual things you use or services. For example, Office 365 itself would be a subscription within a tenant. The tenant provides the identity management, and Office is the system that you use. Other examples of SaaS subscriptions are Microsoft Intune or Dynamics. The Azure cloud resources are also managed as subscriptions, but in this case, those are not monolithic systems which are a subscription. Rather, you manage the subscription yourself. A subscription is a container for resources. So in the Azure world, in the Azure cloud world, you'll have subscriptions. Subscriptions are often units of payment. So there need to be a payer for each subscription. Of course, an enterprise may pay for multiple subscriptions using one agreement, but each subscription can have a different payer. If it's a personal subscription, might be free, might be paid by credit card. Below a subscription, we have resource groups. Resource groups are just folders which include resources groups which include resources. They are often used for permission management or just grouping for documentational reasons. So you can provide permission to users or a group of users to do something over a resource group. Inside the resource groups, you have resources. Resources are the basic building block of your cloud environment. It might be a system, a VM. It might be a database. It might be a firewall. It might be a hub, event hub, which is a queuing service. So it might be IaaS, infrastructure as a service, VMs. It might be PaaS, which is platform as a service, things which you use to connect and work without actually managing the VMs. Azure Sentinel, while it is very much software as a service, is delivered as an Azure resource. So Sentinel is in entirety, or rather the workspace, which is Sentinel, an instance of Sentinel, is an Azure resource. It has a big advantage. It means that the larger Azure management framework, as well as any component of Azure, works seamlessly with Sentinel, such as permission management, user management, and in many cases, integration points. It's one of the reasons that collecting information from all Azure resources into Azure Sentinel is so simple. Before I go into the Azure Sentinel workspace, the resource which is Azure Sentinel, I want to mention another concept. We mentioned tenant, subscriptions, and resource groups. Those are entirely unrelated to the regions and geos in which the actual computing operates. So Azure has a large number of regions. Each dot, and I'm sure this slide is not up to date anymore, is a region. A region is essentially one or a group of data centers working together. And a geo is a group of regions which are belong to a single geographical unit in terms of regulatory requirements. Before I move on, I want to mention something important. Today, we support, you can run Azure Sentinel in most of the regions. So you can have your workspace in most of those regions listed here, not 100%. Specifically, I think that we do not support China, which is a unique region that works differently. We do support, starting from last month, the US federal regions, which is another type of specific exceptional region. That said, we do not commit today, and that we have a work in progress to increase that all the data stays at rest in the region. Today, the only two locations in which we keep all the data local is the US and Western Europe, or EMEA. Sorry, the European Union for that matter. From all other geographies, a small part of the data may go to another region. We are working to be local in more regions over time. We are starting with Australia as early as this month. So after covering regions, and keep in mind that there's no relation between a tenant, a subscription, a resource group, or a region. A subscription can have resources which are deployed in many different regions, for example. Let's go to the most important resource for this discussion, the workspace, the Azure Sentinel workspace. The Azure Sentinel workspace can be thought of as the container for Azure Sentinel. It includes, and keep in mind, it's not a physical definition, though the workspace does live in a specific region. It includes the event database, so the actual data store. It includes settings such as rules, so the analytic rules that generate alerts and incidents. It includes the incidents data. So when a machine learning or a rule trigger an incident, it is also stored in the workspace. Not all resources that are used as part of Azure Sentinel live in the workspace. The reason is that we utilize a lot of the larger Azure ecosystem, which is focused on the Azure Monitor ecosystem. So playbooks, which are logic up automation flows, and workbooks, which is our method to do dashboards and reports, are both resources which are not part of the workspace. They are stored separately. The way to make sure that they are part of the system is to store them in the same resource group. So creating a resource group dedicated to this instance of Azure Sentinel is a good way to group all the resources that belong to the same instance, the workspace and ancillary resources such as playbooks and workbooks, which are managed separately. When I say manage separately, you do create them from the Azure Sentinel user interface. You use them from the Azure Sentinel user interface. They're just behind the scenes. They are separate resources. For example, for the purpose of automated configuration management, which we'll see in a few minutes. When I use the term an Azure Sentinel workspace, I need to stress that Azure Sentinel is, practically speaking, a solution built on top of an important Azure service called Log Analytics. If you go to a Log Analytics workspace and look for the solutions list on it, you'll see a solution called Security Insights, which is essentially the existence of Azure Sentinel in the workspace. So when you create a workspace, it is a logical analytic workspace always. It supports any feature that Log Analytics support, and it is enabled with Azure Sentinel to acquire the additional functionality which Azure Sentinel provides, such as, for example, analytic rules, hunting, or incident management. This is a very important implication, which means that if something is documented and works for Log Analytics, it works for Sentinel as well. We are essentially upward compatible with Log Analytics. It also means that any discussion around Log Analytics workspaces applies also to Azure Sentinel. So after we discussed the basic details of Azure, as well as the important resource for our discussion, which is the workspace, the Azure Sentinel element. Let's get into the core of the presentation today, which is multi-workspaces best practices. The first question is, why will you need multiple workspaces? It's a system, use one. You can get all the value from Azure Sentinel using a single workspace. The reasons that you'll find that you need more than one workspace are those. A very common one is permission management. You want to ensure the access of specific people just to the data that is relevant for them. The real solution for that is not multiple workspaces. We have a feature which is better and better documented. I'll discuss it a bit today. And if you go to the Ninja training, you'll find a link to a blog post about it, which is called Resource RBAC, which enables you to provide access to data owners just to the data that are that's relevant to them within the workspace. But there are other reasons that may require you to actually have multiple workspaces. The first one is if you have multiple SOCs. Resource RBAC enable access to non-SOC users to their data. You'll see the details later on. If you have multiple SOCs in the organization, each one of them requiring access to different data. For example, you have a global SOC and each department or subsidiary has their own SOC. Or if you're an MSSP, but you do want to provide your customers with SOC capabilities as well, it's a shared management of the SOC. You may need more than one workspace. Certainly, if you're MSSP, each customer will need a Sentinel workspace. You may be required to have multiple workspaces because the data has to stay somewhere. For example, you may have a US and European entities, each one contributing to the SOC, but the data for each one has to stay locally within the EU and within the US. And lastly, if you have multiple Azure tenants, which is given if you're an MSSP and you manage customer tenants, and might be the case in an organization where you have multiple tenants because you manage different identity domains, you will need in all those cases multiple workspaces. There are other reasons that sometimes drive to multiple workspaces. I would argue, I shouldn't argue, that they don't have to. There are solutions which are outlined here, but sometimes it's not enough and customers do prefer to have multiple workspaces for those reasons. So for example, you might want fine-grained retention setting. Until a year ago, the only way to do fine-grained retention settings was by separating to multiple workspaces. Each workspace had a one retention setting determining how much time the data is kept. Today, there is a table level retention setting option within the workspace that greatly reduced the need to separate workspaces based on retention setting. Sometimes you have multi-workspace architecture because of legacy reasons. That's the way that they were created. I'll share with you that historically, log analytics recommend a larger number of workspaces, and so did Azure Security Center, to other products which use the same workspaces. And the features such as table level retention or resource RBAC, which I mentioned before, created to reduce the need for excessive workspace separation, were added later on. If you start early on, you may have as much as one workspace per subscription in your organization, which is a lot. Lastly, workspaces are used to, I mentioned subscriptions are used as billing centers. So separating a workspace per subscription for the data belonging to the subscription is an easy way to assign cost. That said, it does complicate the system, and we have all the tools to provide billing reporting within a single workspace to support charging back to data owners. But it does require internal billing. So all those reasons may or may not force you into separate workspaces. I would suggest that it complicates the implementation. You want to have less, but sometimes it's a requirement. The bottom line, and I'm missing a slide here, which I thought would be the next, is that you would want to reduce the number of workspaces that you have, but you will never get to just one in a large organization, certainly in an MSSP where you would probably want to have at least one workspace per customer. As a result, I need to provide you with all the means as to how to work in a multi-workspace environment, even if the number is significantly reduced. The hybrid model is the Azure Sentinel model for managing multiple workspaces within a subsidiary or across subsidiaries or customers in an MSSP scenario. The important aspect here is that our best practice model does not call for copying data to a central location. Our best practice is to keep the data local in a workspace within the tenant that belongs to the customer or subsidiary. It has many advantages. We'll see them in a minute. The central SIM, so to speak, because it's a cloud, is a virtual one. You don't really have a central SIM system. You have an interface which enables you to manage together all those Sentinel instances, all those separate workspaces, which will be potentially in different tenants across your customer base or across your subsidiaries. So multiple workspaces, each one of them is a full Sentinel system, but a central management, a single console to manage incident. I do want to mention that in real life, okay, while we're working and we do want to make you all comfortable managing incidents in the Azure Sentinel interface, many organizations and certainly many MSSPs have another system on top of Azure Sentinel to manage tickets. Often it's ServiceNow or a source system such as Resilient, or a proprietary MSSP portal. In all those cases, okay, you have the option to integrate directly from the workspaces, the incidents to the central screen. So what we should do now is first discuss the hybrid model differences, why it's good and what are the challenges, and then try to resolve or share our experiences to the best way to work with the hybrid model to overcome the challenges. So the advantages. First of all, by having a separate instance, a bit akin to a dedicated system for each customer, okay, but located in the cloud. Essentially, it's there in the Microsoft data center. You have a great flexibility in dividing the role between the central entity, global SOC, or service provider, and the local entity, the local SOC or the customer. You can decide that the central entity provides level 1, tier 1 analysis, while the local SOC, which understands better the local IT requirements, provide level 3 and does response. You can do the other way around, more MDR-like, where first level is done by the local SOC, it's just calling a user, better to do geography, and the global SOC are the experts. They look into the deep incidents and resolve them. And the change is not a change of system, it's just a change of permissions. That's all there is. So very flexible role management. Another big advantage is no data ownership or data privacy challenges. The workspace is wherever it should be. Geographically speaking, tenant speaking, the data belongs there. You don't have to take, if you're an MSSP, you don't have to take ownership of your customer data. It stays in their tenant. You manage it, You may be the only one with access to it. We'll talk about the CSP model later on, but you don't have to get between the customer and the national data privacy officer. It minimizes network latency and charges because the data can stay local to wherever you are collecting, and it's very easy to onboard and offboard customer subsidiaries. Just start a new instance. Starting a new instance is very, very easy. You can have another customer in 5 minutes. But it does open the question of how to do several things. First of all, if it's different instances in different workspaces, I'll have to let you know how to centrally monitor them as a single system. How do I make those distributed instances into a centrally monitored system for the global SOC or for the MSSP? I will also have to share with you how to best do central deployment and configuration. If you want that rule to be available in all workspaces, if you want to make sure that the same workbooks or dashboards are available to all customers, how do you do that? And lastly, a topic which is specifically of interest to MSSPs is IP protection. If the workspace lives within the customer tenant, how do I protect my own intellectual property? My rules, my workbooks, my playbooks, etc., my machine learning models. We'll discuss all that in the coming slides. So, how do I implement those multiple workspaces? It's a 5-step plan. You'll see that I'm bluffing here because each step has a lot of sub-steps. But 5 steps are a good way to outline the challenge we have. So first of all, I did mention that it's worthwhile to reduce the number of workspaces. You don't want to have too many, and I'll share with you a few of the capabilities that will help you minimize the number of workspaces. It's always less work. Or if you start from scratch, to make sure that you don't have too many. Then we'll discuss how do you work, how do you monitor across workspaces. Essentially, that's the analyst section. How does an analyst looks at all the workspaces as a single Sentinel system? The third step would be how do you manage and configure across workspaces? Unlike the analyst side where we have a UI for you to do that, for a deployment configuration, we don't have a cross workspace UI, and I'll discuss automation, which personally I think are anyways the right solution for a cloud world. We'll see the details. Everything I said so far was a cross workspace capability, which works for workspaces within the same tenant. However, as I presented the problem, in many cases, it will be across tenant boundaries. For example, if you're an MSSP, the workspace would be the customer tenant. You'll have to jump across the boundary between the tenants. And Azure Lighthouse would be our method to do this jumping and extend the cross workspace capabilities to be cross tenant. And lastly, I marked it as optional. In some cases, you actually have a system on top of Azure Sentinel in which you manage tickets. As I mentioned, ServiceNow is a very common system for that. And you want to integrate this cross workspace multi-instance Sentinel implementation with this ticketing system. I'll talk a bit about that. Step 1, consolidated work services. As I mentioned, we want to get from many to few, but nearly never to one. A few steps around that. So you want to send an event to a central workspace. They may be already sent somewhere else. So you may want to use dual fitting. You may want to send the data which is already sent for another user for another purpose also to the central Sentinel workspace. The agent multi-homing and the destination setting for other Azure resources enable you to do that. You can change where the data goes. Sometimes you don't have to keep the original one. Sometimes you can you do need the original one, which does have cost impact. But you can change. As I mentioned, historically, there was a requirement to use a lot of workspaces. Try to reduce that. Keep in mind that, well, historically, sending data across subscription lines was hard. Today, every service can send the data. Any Azure service or a VM can send the data to any workspace within the tenant. You don't need to keep within a subscription. I want to mention a specific point about Azure Security Center. Azure Security Center often uses a default workspace created per subscription, so you don't have to know about that. If you move to work with a Sentinel alongside Azure Security Center, you want to centralize the Azure Security Center workspace. It's a simple setting outlined in the link here that will enable you to specify the central workspace without any impact to your AAC functionality. In practice, the AAC functionality does not require the data collected. It's done before storage, and the data collection is therefore investigating after the fact incidents, which is shared with Sentinel. So do route the events to a central workspace. Lastly, the bigger topic around here is use of resource RBAC. Resource RBAC is not new by now. It's a feature that allows access to data in the workspace to external users. I labeled them here non-SOC team, without giving them access to all data, just what belongs to them. Resource RBAC works by tagging each event sent to the workspace with a resource ID, and then giving external teams log viewer permission over those resources. Let's understand the difference between the SOC team and the non-SOC team and how they view and use the data. The SOC team has permissions to the workspace and has access to the entire Sentinel experience. They can use a SIM. It might be limited by some permission capabilities within the workspace. For example, a user might be able to manage incidents but not go and create rules. But generally speaking, the SOC team has access to the workspace and the data within it. The non-SOC team does not have access to the workspace. They actually do not have permissions to the workspace. They just have log viewer permissions to specific resources they are tagged for. The way that they will consume the data would be using just query and dashboards or workbooks. And they'll get to them not through the Sentinel UI, but rather through the resource group UI, as you can see here. So it's the lock screen, the same lock screen, it's workbooks, the same workbooks, but still a different UI. It can be either the resource group which contains the resources they have options with them, or directly the log screen and workbook screen for the resource in Azure, or they can go to Azure Monitor. In Azure Monitor, they can select the subscriptions they want to search within. In all those cases, okay, users outside of the SOC will always see just information about resources they are have permissions for. As mentioned, this requires assigning a resource ID to every event, and the list here suggests how you ensure that each event in the workspace is tagged correctly. For anything Azure, that's by default. Azure resources tag every event they send to Sentinel with their resource ID. That makes sense. The same goes for agents which are installed on VMs in Azure. Those will send the VM resource ID. And again, it means it has a resource ID, and whoever has logged viewer permission over this VM, we'll be able to see just the logs for this VM. We recently extended the option for resource ID management to on-prem by using a technology called Azure Arc, which enables you to include on-prem VMs in the larger Azure management framework and assign a resource ID. Lastly, when you do remote collection, for example, syslog or Ceph, the resource ID assigned to the event would be the resource ID of the collector VM. This has a restriction that you have to collect all the events you want a group to have permission to on a separate collector VM. So you'll need a collector VM for the Windows team and a collector VM for the Linux team if they need access to separate events. All in all, mostly out of the box, sometimes with a bit of being careful about how you manage your collector VMs, you can ensure that every resource has a resource ID, and within a single workspace, non-SOC team have access just to their data. It's a major method to reduce the number of workspaces you'll need. The last method I'll mention around reducing the number of workspaces is retention. Sometimes multiple workspaces are used just because for firewalls you need the 1 month retention, and for Office data you need 2 years retention. Now you can set the retention period for each table separately, so you can do it within a single workspace. So all along, I just told you how to have less workspaces. I did mention that you'll still have multiple workspaces at the end of the day, and there are reasons for that. So how do you use multiple workspaces as seen like one system? The first element is cross-workspace queries. Cross-workspace queries can be used in the log screen. They are the easiest way to access data. There is a syntax for them. It looks complicated, you know, the upper yellow text, because it has to mention all the workspaces. Luckily, there is a feature in Azure Sentinel, inherited from Log Analytics, called a view function. And you can essentially alias, save the long expression in yellow under a short name, in this case CWS, cross workspace security event, and then an analyst only need this cross workspace security event tag as the table name to use in queries. So the complexity of what are the different workspaces, where they are, what their name is all hidden by defining the right view function in the workspace, in the central workspace that the user is using, and then using this view function to do simple searches as you are used to when using a single workspace architecture. A second technology that works very nicely with multiple workspace are workbooks or dashboarding technology. Actually, when you use a workbook, you can use cross-workspace queries, which I presented before. Workbooks are based a lot on queries, but the workbook editor actually has a workspace selector, so you can select multiple workspaces directly from the UI, making usage of multiple workspaces even easier. Lastly, a feature that's in private preview, and I'm showing with you now, we announced it at RSA and we hope to get to public preview very shortly, would be a central incident screen. And for that, I'll go into a demo. So here I have a screen and I'm selecting Azure Sentinel. And unlike the Azure Sentinel workspace selector that you have in your own system, and I do hope you already have a Sentinel system. Here you can actually select multiple workspaces and go a single multiple Sentinel instance screen for all of them. It's the same instance screen that you are used to. You can manage each incident, the severity, the status, the assignee. You can investigate each incident. as you would usually do. So a single regular Azure Sentinel incident management screen, but the incident comes from specific workspaces. You can see the name here. Most are from our demo. One of them is not. So we have a screen which consolidates the incidents across workspaces. Now, already being a demo, I want to get into something which I'll mention later, but I'll demo now, which is Lighthouse. I mentioned a lot of cross-workspace capabilities. I mentioned cross-workspace queries. I mentioned cross-workspace workbooks, and I mentioned the new cross-workspace incident screen. The question is, how do we extend them across tenant borders? And the answer is Lighthouse. If I go here in my system to the directory and subscription selector, you see that now I'm in my demo tenant user, but if I go to my Microsoft user, and hopefully I will not have to re-authenticate. Otherwise, it would have been a very good example of multi-factor authentication, but it will take time. So if I go here, you'll see that I have a much larger options of workspaces. And you can see that they're from different directories. Contoso is our demo one, that's the 5 that I had before. But I have a large number of workspaces which are within the Microsoft tenant and I have access to. The key to that is the selector here. Now that I'm in my Microsoft user, I have here a choice of tenants that I can select. The Microsoft one, the demo one, I can select both or multiple ones. And then I have here the list of subscriptions, of workspaces across the tenants. I can now go and select again, but I can also select other workspaces from a different tenant, and I can go and see incidents across workspaces from different tenants. So, and I guess that here all of them, all the incidents. Oh, actually, I do have alerts from different workspaces across different tenants. So, to sum up, Lighthouse is a key enabling technology that enables us to really work across tenants, utilizing the existing or planned cross workspace capabilities. So Sentinel works across workspaces, and Lighthouse takes those capabilities and extend them to cross tenant boundaries. So I went over all that using a demo. Now, I discussed in some length how you work across workspaces and using Lighthouse across tenants. When you're an analyst, you search, you hunt, you use workbooks to monitor or to investigate, and you want a central incident screen. On the other hand, now if you move from the analyst to the engineer, we also have to manage multiple workspaces. We have to configure them. We have to make sure that all content is available across them. As of today, we do not have a UI for managing content across workspaces. What we offer, and I'm a big believer in that, is automation. We have we are being a cloud service. We are very much API first, and we have API capabilities. Some of them API, some of them wrapped by ARM or PowerShell, to deploy and configure everything in the system, everything. And luckily, Javier and Philippe from our OCP team created a solution around that stitches together the capabilities into a full CI/CD management of Azure Sentinel. And you wouldn't believe how popular is the blog post they released on that. The flow goes like that. You manage all the content in GitHub. You define GitHub as the core repository in Azure DevOps. And then using Azure DevOps pipelines, we provide all the scripts to deploy the content. This will mean a workflow in which you develop and manage the content, analytics rules, hunting queries, playbooks, workbooks, whatever have you, in GitHub. You get all the benefits of full audit, full traceability, commenting, approval, rollback if needed, as well as automatic deployment of the content to one or more Azure Sentinel workspaces. And of course, the word more here is the important one for our discussion. So our best practice for managing content is anyways using full CI/CD capabilities. I think that's the cloud way. And that also supports very well working across workspaces. And again, using Lighthouse, you can have those workspaces across across tenants. I did mention Lighthouse, and I did show you the capability. Again, it's a very important infrastructure technology available as part of Azure, which extends different data access capabilities across tenant boundaries, and we extend cross-tenant queries, workbooks, data screen, and automation from being a multi-workspace to being multi-tenant capabilities. For time purposes, I'll skip on integration with ticketing system. I'll go into the MSSP specific topics for those MSSP engineers that or architects that join just for that. I'll talk about two things in short. First of all, MSSP billing options. Sentinel is charged based on consumption. It's pretty typical to SIM, gigabyte per day. As an MSSP, you provide a service you want to get money and charge the customer. The way to be a reseller, actually buy services from Microsoft and sell it to the customer, when our best practice is to have the workspace as part of the customer tenant, is using a solution called Cloud Solution Provider, which means that you own a subscription within the customer tenant. So it's part of the customer tenant for the purposes of the discussion in this webinar, but it is paid for and managed, and the root key for it belongs to you as a service provider. It's the way for you to get a bill and charge the customer whatever you want. And you'll get a reseller discount as you would in any reselling option. Sometimes it's not the best option, mostly for commercial, larger framework reasons. And then you'll have to work, the customer will pay their own bills, and you'll sell them service and charge them for the services. In this case, we still have an option for you to gain from the customer usage and get money in terms of spiffs, money back, for the fact that you made the customer use more services from Microsoft, but you're not in the way, you're not getting billed for Sentinel, you don't bill the customer for it, you just get spiffs or some money back from the money that we got from the customer. So that's the billing options. A large discussion. I want to mention the options that you'll have a discussion with your OCP partner manager around that. Lastly, a topic that we hear a lot from partners, especially given that our model calls for storing the workspace at the customer tenant, and it is, how do you protect my IP? I developed rules and dashboards, etc., and I want to protect them and not have the customer just copy them. So there are two solutions for that. The first one is to run the content from your own tenant. Essentially using the same capabilities that I mentioned. You can run queries. I mentioned cross-tenant queries. You can run for hunting, for example. You can run playbooks and automation across tenant boundaries, and you can run workbooks across tenant boundaries today. So create them in your own MSP tenant and have them work against data from the customer tenant. There's one area we don't provide a solution today. It's a work in progress. We also plan to have rules run across tenant boundaries. And once that's available, you'll be able to also keep the rules to yourselves. One thing to keep in mind is that if you deploy workbooks, which many times the customer needs access to, at your tenant, you still need to give the customer access to the workbook to see the reports and dashboards. And the way to do it would be, again, Lighthouse. You'll just enable the customer to view your tenant by doing reverse Lighthouse, providing access to the customer to your tenant just for the purpose of viewing workbooks. The second option, which I'll finish with, is to use a CSP subscription. I mentioned the cloud solution provider subscription as a subscription that you own and pay for as a customer tenant. Actually, you have the master key. The customer does not need, by default, the customer does not have any access to the CSP subscription. We know that many customers do want some insight into the CSP subscription. They hate having something in their tenant which is just a black box for them, but you can have them, provide them just with the right permissions to view whatever they need access for, rather than everything. That way, not exposing your IP. So to summarize, before I get back to Valon, and I'll go back to the relevant slide for that, and then go back down. I suggested that you will probably need, for every MSSP and for every large customer with multiple subsidiaries and departments, to have multiple workspaces. The reason is that our model for running Azure Sentinel across large organizations is to have more than one workspace, at least one per tenant or one per customer at the destination tenant. I suggested that the way to work with that is first to have less workspaces, but still you'll have a few. And then we offer the ways using the UI to work across workspaces, have a central interface that works with incidents and data, which is still not moved from the originating workspaces. And for the management configuration, for which we don't have a UI, to use automation, which anyways I think are the best practice for managing a SIEM these days. Lastly, all those capabilities are cross workspace capabilities. Lighthouse extend them to be cross tenant capabilities. So with that in mind, I'll get you back to Valon for question and summary.
Perfect. Thank you, Ofer. Although the team here has answered the bulk of the questions, but there's some at the beginning when you were touching over the regions. Yeah, there's a question, where can we have more details about the data at rest is not kept on the same region as the Azure Sentinel workspace? And the sub question to that one, again, region specific, was some other regions able to be stored in other country? Would it be possible for malware in the region that are stored local only, like the US ones?
So since this is a formal regulatory point, it is clearly documented in several Azure pages. We have to say exactly where we store data at rest. I'll reiterate here, I did jump a bit fast on that. Today, for any region in Europe, in the EU, I should say, the data remains in the EU, but can be also in EU West, meaning in Amsterdam. So in your own region, but also in Amsterdam. Anything else in the world, the data can be in the region where you established Sentinel, as well as in the US, one of two regions in the US. We understand the challenge. Keep in mind, the challenge is not latency, speed is fine. It's really not a problem. The challenge is regulation, if you have any. And we are working to make more regions fully containing all the data at rest. I mentioned that Australia is the first one where at least we're doing that. And actually, as of today, all new deployments in Australia are already local. We still have not moved all the existing ones. And we are working on a roadmap for others. You mentioned malware. I don't think malware is the main issue here. Our data centers are roughly as safe as each other. I hope they are very safe. I guess that the main question here is regulatory compliance and sovereignty. And I understand that in many countries the data has to stay local, and we're working to make that available to more countries.
Great, thank you for that. Next one is, can there be one central location for threat intelligence across Azure Sentinel instances for the MSSP?
So our current solutions for threat intelligence do not allow for central location. It has to be replicated across the different workspaces. The actual setup of that can be automated, so the automation part is easier. When we introduce cross-tenant or cross-workspace rules, you will be able to use the central threat intelligence across all workspaces.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll just briefly recap here. In fact, just summarize on what we have upcoming in regards to Sentinel webinars. So this week, Wednesday, we have actually the threat hunting on AWS using Sentinel. So that's April 22nd. And then the next scheduled one we have on May 13, using Sigma to accelerate your SIEM transformation to Azure Sentinel. We do have also a few more in the pipeline, and just for the save the date, June 2nd, we have learned the KQL you need for Azure Sentinel. June 15, we have deploying and managing Azure Sentinel as code. And then we have June 23rd, multi-tenant investigation. And all the details and registrations you can find at aka.ms/security webinars. In case we missed to answer your question, or if you have additional questions, you can visit us on Azure Sentinel forum at aka.ms/security, aka.ms/Azure Sentinel community. Thank you, Ofer, for an excellent presentation. Thank you to the rest of the team who helped answering the questions. And most of all, I would like to thank all of you for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye till then.